It's the Boris Dirk podcast, and we are back with our second of 3 enlightened draft preview episodes. Today we're doing a segment called I Don't Get It. Max and I are just going to go back and forth, picking apart guys we think are too high on big boards, too high on mock drafts, and it's going to get a little negative, but we'll try to mix in some positive stuff because all of these guys are really good at basketball, and let's run it. And I'll just do them together, even if it's unfair because they're not Siamese. But the Thompson brothers. I have Aaaand Thompson at 6 on my board. And I haven't seen him below 5 anywhere. I think most people have him in their top 4 because of his absurd athleticism and other really interesting tools. I have Aaaand at 6, which is not too far from consensus, and his brother Ausar at 11, which I think is more significant. The ceilings aren't my concern. I think the floor is incredibly scary. And as like a fan of a team that's drafted a few massive busts, like I'd just be so nervous if somehow the Blazers came away from this draft with one of the Thompson brothers. And it's pretty simple. They played an overtime elite. And if you try to watch tape on these guys, I swear to God, 80% of it is literally just fast break, flying to the basket, alley-oops, pick sixes, very little half-court offense. And I have a really hard time evaluating these guys because both brothers are incredibly athletic. I think Aaaand has a slight edge just in terms of explosiveness because Aaaand is like in that 0.01% of jumpers, runners, lateral movers, all of it. He's got like Zion level burst. He just weighs 100 fewer pounds. But real doubts about both of their shooting. I'm really worried that guys who are at this stage non-shooters and are athleticism first, how they're going to adjust when they've spent the last 2 years playing against guys who are actually younger than them. In a league devoid of NBA talent. I would be scared to take them even where I have them on my board.
A lot of times in the draft, when you go back and look at it many years later, picks 6 to 10 are more riddled with mistakes than picks 11 to 15. And I think a lot of that comes from teams in the back half of the top 10 still swinging on these high upside guys who have sort of much lower floors and them just kind of busting out of the league, as opposed to teams once you get past 10 where they're just looking for useful players. And sometimes those guys, hit really big, like Kawhi Leonard or, Donovan Mitchell, things like that, guys drafted between 10 and 15. Yeah. But all that is to say, I think this is going to be a draft where that 5 to 10 range is going to have a lot of it's going to be a minefield. As opposed to that 10 to 15 range where you could have some real studs get picked. Having said that, I am higher on the Thompsons than you are. People put I feel like a lot of differentiation between Aaaand and Ausar, where they see Aaaand as being significantly better than Ausar. I don't really see that much differentiation between the two of them. Like when I was watching, it's not just that they're identical, but when I was watching the two of them, like their games are extremely similar. Ausar has a slightly better looking jumper and Aaaand handles the ball slightly more than Ausar does, but that didn't necessarily indicate to me that Ausar can't handle the ball. It just seemed like the ball was, they just picked Aaaand to be the point guard. I don't know if at lower levels, he's been more of a point guard also, but yeah, I think Ausar is a little bit of a safer prospect because I do trust him to be able to shoot a little bit better, whereas Aaaand really has like a hitch in his jumper that I think might be unfixable or just really limit his ceiling as a shooter. Yeah. But in terms of getting it, I think once you get past those first 3 of Vic, Scoot, and Brandon Miller, I think those are the only 2 guys who their combination of size, ball handling, passing, ability to create for others, and then just otherworldly athleticism gives them that high level ceiling of someone who could be an all-star, all NBA performer if all of those things hit. But their floor is so low because of their lack of experience playing real basketball, because overtime elite is not real basketball from everything that I've watched. And then also their lack of ability to really shoot at a high level. Like, I don't trust either of them to hit a pull up 15-footer. Like, if my life depended on it, I would be dead. And yeah, I think both of them are very high risk prospects. And this is a draft where there's not a lot of, there's a lot of high risk prospects, honestly, and a lot of safe prospects. And teams are going to have to make their own risk calculus of when they're ready to sort of start shifting their focus to the safer guys. Because there are plenty of guys in this draft who could step in and be, help your team win from an early stage, and be quality role players. But then there's also these guys with otherworldly athletic gifts where it's not clear if they know how to play basketball. And you sort of have to pick and choose where you want to take those swings. I think the ball handling and just insane, like both of them, both Amen and Ausar are going to walk into the league as two of the most athletic wings in the league. Like, they have, even exceeding an Andrew Wiggins level of athleticism, maybe like an Iguodala in his prime level of athleticism, maybe even more, like that T-Mac level of athleticism. That's kind of the plane that they're operating on, which you just don't see that much from that sort of 6'7" size. But yeah, that's what people see with them. And I can see why you wouldn't get it, or I can see why someone wouldn't get it, because the lack of shooting is so glaring. And when you watch them play, it's just not real basketball. But at the same time, I think I could see taking them that high, even though some GM's probably going to get fired for taking one of them.
Yeah. And Amen, maybe both. Amen has non-God-given traits that are really interesting to me. Like you mentioned, he's more often on the ball so far, because they play together and there's only one ball. And Amen's live dribble passing is actually really interesting to me. And like, I think that could be his on-ball half-court special tool. It's just like he's a walking paint touch and he can get guys open shots that way. But I really tried to talk myself into like the potential for shooting. And then I saw Amen's workouts the last couple of weeks. And like you said, it actually got worse. Like there's some 3-point makes he had this year in Overtime Elite, where I was a little bit more optimistic. But I think he's really overthinking his jumper right now. He's definitely added a hitch. And so, yeah, I just don't get it, because these are two 20-year-old uber talented guys that have been competing against teenagers, both shot in the 60s in free throw percentage and in the 20s in 3-point shooting. And I worry about how they're going to be productive when the game slows down. And then, both are 6'6" with a 7-foot wingspan, in addition to that crazy quick twitch stuff. But it's hard for me to evaluate them as defenders, because they didn't have to defend a lot of really tough opponents. And so like I think both of these guys could end up being really good defenders, but I just feel like I'm guessing. But I have Amen in a tier, which is my guys I've ranked 6 through 9, and he's in a tier with Kobe Buffkin, CD Sissoko, and Cason Wallace, who are just 3 guys that have shown me real things against NBA talent, more tangible NBA skills. And I understand that sometimes in the draft you have to swing knowing you could get your heart broken. But I just think that those 3 guys have really high ceilings as well. And so I'm scared to fall for what I think are the twin sirens of this draft. Who's somebody you don't get it with?
The main guy I don't get it with is Jarace Walker. He's power forward from Houston, 6'8", 240 pounds. He's an all off the bus kind of player. Like when you see him walk into the gym, he's really physically imposing.
Coach, is that who we're playing?
Exactly. He looks like Isaiah Stewart already, and he's 18, 19 years old. But I see a lot of draft boards that have him or almost every draft board you'll see has him somewhere between 5 and 10.
Yeah.
And I have him all the way down at 21.
And he moved up today after you did a little more tape.
Yes, he was down at 28 before, and I did a little more tape, and I was like, maybe I didn't give quite enough credit to his passing, so I moved him up to 21. But I don't get it. I look at him. I see someone, I feel like he's being billed as like a big wing, sort of a Jeremy Grant type.
Yeah.
But I don't see that level of fluidity. I think he's strong. And I think when he has time to load up, he is like powerful.
Yeah.
But I don't think he's a particularly fluid or quick athlete. So I don't see him being like a wing lockdown defender, sliding with guys like, uh,
Chris
being someone
Middleton.
like, yeah, I don't see him being someone like Aaron Gordon, who would probably be a good comp for him, perhaps. But I don't see him being someone like Aaron Gordon who can go from,
Yeah.
sliding his, like banging with LeBron to sliding his feet on Devin Booker to, chasing around Jimmy Butler to, trying to bother KD, Kawhi, all these different types of players. Jarace to me seems like someone who's more comfortable. I think he would be comfortable kind of banging with this version of LeBron, but I don't see him, chasing guys around screens or doing things like that. But
Yeah.
then I also, if he's not going to be a wing, then that means he's a big. And if I'm looking at him as a big, he's not that big. If he's a big, he's a small big. He's about 6'8" in shoes. I think he's measured at 6'6" without shoes at the combine.
Yeah.
And he just seems like he can sort of provide some secondary rim protection, but he's not like a great shot blocker. And he's pretty good off the ball. He can sort of stand guys up in the post and he can move his feet a little with guards, but I wouldn't trust him to like stop guards. He gave up plenty of blow-bys in the games that I saw, both to guards and wings. And that's when, he's being billed as a defensive prospect. When you look at the offensive side of the ball, I do think he has some real signs in terms of his passing. He,
Yeah.
he hit some pretty high level reads of like passing out of double teams to the opposite corner, some really nice kind of lay down passes to the big man on drives. But I don't trust him to be a good shooter. When I look at his form, I don't see someone who's going to be a knockdown shooter. It's probably going to take a lot of work for him to be just a serviceable shooter in the NBA. I'm not sure what his free throw numbers are, but anecdotally felt like he missed a lot of them. He's good around the basket, but I don't trust him to have any sort of pull-up game or, being much more than an average or slightly below average three-point shooter. So when you put that all together, yeah, he's got a great body and, will be useful on defense, but I don't think he'll be some stopper.
Yeah.
And if you're just looking at someone who's like a big wing or small ball, big man who's good, but not amazing on defense and then doesn't have really any bankable offensive skill, I just think there's a lot of guys, specifically 20 in this draft, that I would rather take. But what do you see with him? Because I know you're a little higher than him on me, but still lower than consensus.
I have Jarace at 13, which I think most would say is like a little bit lower than consensus. I'm of the opinion that the league is so bad at drafting that I'm sick of this, like, oh, I have him at 8 and you have him at 13. That's such a big difference. I don't know. We need to have another talk at some point just about the way draft consensus works and like the differences in boards and the way we identify where we stand on certain guys. But if I was gonna say if there's anything I get with the Thompson twins, it's their movement patterns and just like the God-given way that they glide through air. And I don't feel great about Jarace Walker's movement patterns, which scares me because I feel like he's billed as an athlete first and foremost. And now,
Yes.
as you mentioned, like 6'8" in shoes, he has the 7'2" wingspan. So he is big enough to guard a lot of bigs in the modern NBA. And something that we just kind of glaze over, but is really legit is like you can be a 6'8" center in the league if you're long enough. It's not the top of your head that contests shots. It's your hands. It's how high your hands get. He has like the standing reach of like your average NBA four. And he's very strong. He doesn't play with strength on offense. You mentioned he's an off the bus guy. I can't tell you how many times I just wanted him to dunk on someone when I watched him this year, and he went for a runner or some weak floater against a guy who weighs half as much.
Yeah.
So that worries me. But as you mentioned, there's some passing feel there. And I do think that he is a winning player in terms of like if your team drafts Jarace Walker, he will arrive day one eager to play the role that you need him to play to win games. And I agree that he's not very twitchy, but he did register a 38-inch vert at the combine and a really good standing vert too. which is more indicative of rim protection ability. So like he can jump. It's a little bit mechanical.
Yeah, it's
But
not fluid.
yeah, but I think I have him in at the end of my lottery because I think that he's going to make threes in the next couple of years. I do believe he's going to be a reasonable catch and shoot three guy. And I think that he's really bought into entering the league as a 3 and D like specialist. I don't see him ever being great on guards. I think that he could maybe switch out onto some smaller guys and it wouldn't be a huge L for your team. But mostly I want him on bigger wings, forwards, and some centers. And I think that he has real appeal to like the Spurs, for instance, who are about to have Victor Wembanyama, who might not be ready to guard some real true NBA fives that weigh 280 pounds plus. Maybe Jarace is the guy that you cross match on Wembanyama's opposing center. Or if you have Chet Holmgren and he's not ready to body up a grown man, maybe Jarace is that kind of guy. I have a little bit of hope that he has real upside as like a short roll passer. And if I'm being optimistic about Jarace, I'm just telling myself like he had 1 year on one of the most stacked teams in the country. His Houston team had several vets, and one of them we're going to talk about later, probably not on this episode, Marcus Sasser, but like there were a lot of guys that needed the ball. And he arrived on a team with upperclassmen, that didn't want to share. But if you told me that there's a rookie who's playing defense in the playoffs next year, Jarace is one of the first guys I'd think of.
Yeah. And to be clear, I have him in a tier. I have from 12 to 21 all as one tier. So I honestly see more of a difference between 9 and 12 than I do between 12 and 21, where I have Jarace. I call that tier solid starters.
Yeah. Like I have Bilal Coulibaly, Wembanyama's teammate, in that same tier. And I would rather have Coulibaly for most teams. But if you really want to be good now and you don't have time for a very skinny bouncy project like Coulibaly, I understand going for a guy like Jarace who will arrive in your locker room as a rookie and behave like a veteran. And like you said, he's already built like a veteran, like zero weightlifting needed. He might even want to slim down so that he could be less wingy and more wingy and less biggie.
Yeah.
I don't get Jalen Hood-Schifino. And this one's gonna really hurt you because Max's wildest take is that he has Jalen Hood-Schifino at number 5 on his board. I'm just gonna take that statement away from him right now. And I have Schifino at 23 because got a lot going for him, but I just really worry about his role in the NBA because he had the keys to the offense at Indiana as a freshman, and he did so many things for them. Amazing feel, good ball handler, strong defender. But I see Jalen Hood-Schifino as an off-ball player in the NBA. I don't think he has quite enough to be a primary ball handler. And so it really worries me that I, one, don't trust his three-point shot, and two, I think that he's not explosive at the rim. He's a good athlete in his own ways. Like he's quick laterally. I like his defense a lot. And I think that he's reasonably quick, but he doesn't finish with power at the rim. I think he had like one dunk in the half court as a freshman, even though he's 6'6" and had a size advantage on a lot of his matchups. A lot of the points he was able to generate at the rim in the Big Ten might get swatted or changed in the NBA. And if you're not a really strong finisher and you're not a really strong spot up shooter, what are you as an off ball offensive player in the NBA? And that's my huge reservation on Jalen Hood-Schifino. Your turn.
Yeah. It's an approach thing with whether you think he's going to be an off ball guy or a lead ball handler. And depending on which path you look, it's a rosier outlook on one and not in the other. I think he's a lead ball handler. I don't like him as much as I liked Jalen Williams last year, but I see a lot of similar things in terms of someone who's big, can handle the ball, can run the pick and roll extremely well, make passes with either hand to, remote parts of the court. I think that Indiana team was really weird. Every possession involved Trace Jackson Davis getting the ball on the left side of the court, palming it with his left hand and waving it around over his head until he decided what he wanted to do with it. It wasn't a team that had a lot of spacing. I think if you put Hood-Schifino in a spread pick and roll where he has like real defined options to pass the ball to and not two bigs clogging the lane all the time, as he did in Mike Woodson's offense at Indiana.
Yeah.
I think he can really shine because as we talked about, or, when thinking about the Nuggets and things that were good this year in the playoffs, positional size, intelligence, competitiveness, I think he's like a decent competitor, although I wish his motor would run a little bit higher sometimes. He reminds me a little bit of Lonzo with how he can sometimes seem like he's just kind of cool and chilling through a game, as opposed to like, really being locked in and tenacious. But his size at the point guard position, because I do think he's a point guard, is, well above average at 6'6", although without shoes, it might be more like 6'4", 6'5". And I really love his passing ability. I think he's one of the better passers in this draft. And I think his ball handling at his size with his passing is enough to make him a lead guard in the league. I think that he has a lot of similarities to Lonzo Ball, who was a very quality starter before knee injuries derailed his career. I think he's Lonzo, but with a mid-range game and sort of more of a driving and pull-up game, which Lonzo didn't have. I really like everything he does from the mid-range. Like his mid-range shots are beautiful. I don't want to fall into the trap I fell into with Johnny Davis last year, where I fall in love with this guy who's a great mid-range scorer in college, and it doesn't work out in the NBA because those shots are harder to get to. But I do think his ability to score out of the pick and roll, to pass out of the pick and roll, is very high level. I like the way his shot looks from three. I don't know. I know his percentages weren't great, but he had some, very hot games and some very cold games from three. But I don't see anything mechanically wrong with his jumper that makes me think he won't be able to transfer some of that success from the mid-range out to three. And I do have some concerns about his rim finishing. I think he's similar to Lonzo in that way. And, he's got a little bit of D'Angelo Russell to his game as well, which has its pluses and minuses. But, if he's D'Angelo Russell with better defense, I think that's quite a good player. So yeah, when I look at him, I see the size, I see the passing ability, and the general sort of ability to be a good defender with his length and wingspan, though I wish he'd be a little bit more tenacious at times. And I think that size and ball handling ability gives him a really high ceiling that not a lot of guys in this class have once you get past that top five, which is why I was comfortable putting him so high. I acknowledge that there's a bit of a risk there with if the shot doesn't come along like I think it's going to, but I just, maybe I'm a sucker for these guys who make, the pass. Always for me, it's a thing where like, if you make the pass before I even see that the guy's there, that's something that triggers for me. Like you're really seeing the game at a high level, and he makes a lot of those passes, and he makes them early or on time at the latest. And these are all just things that jumped out to me with him. And maybe I, had some sort of selection bias where the games I saw happened to be some of his better shooting games. I saw another one of his games where he was not shooting the ball as well. And certainly you can see that the game looks a lot worse when he's not hitting shots.
I noticed a lot of left to right misses with him. And his shot doesn't look gross to me at all. As you said, like there are reasons to be optimistic. But I'm just thinking about like how south. I mean, I don't know what's going on with Lonzo's career right now, but Lonzo, when he was healthy, could have really failed in the NBA if he hadn't become an efficient spot up 3-point shooter, because he is that archetype of bigger point guard, not so dynamic with the ball for NBA standards. And so his best role is like beside a ball dominant star. And he can still, utilize his basketball genius in other ways in a more off-ball role. And I worry that some of Hood-Schifino's best tools won't be activated in the NBA because they are on ball, like primary creator tools. And that's why when we started talking about him, I think you were a little bit offended when I mentioned Tyus Jones, because I kind of see him as a larger Tyus Jones, who's a great player. And if that's the outcome, then I should have him higher on my board. But again, if you told me Hood-Schifino was going to shoot threes decently well, he'd be in my lottery. And not only, sorry, I mentioned his lack of explosiveness at the rim. There's also a slight lack of craft. He doesn't have a lot of ways to finish on you, and he isn't able to dunk on you like Bilal Coulibaly.
Sorry, I just opened a deep dive Reddit thread into is Jalen Hood-Schifino a shooter or not? And we've got people pulling up his pull-up percentage and how it's similar, or it's better than a Brandon Miller, a Bryce Sensabaugh, Dariq Whitehead, Jordan Hawkins, Keyonte George, basically better than everyone in the draft except Grady Dick. But these are all single season, like 3-point sample sizes where a couple misses here and there, and your percentage goes from 31 to 42. But I am just basing this on the tape that I watched. And when I watched him shoot, I thought it looked projectable to the NBA. And if I think he's going to be a good shooter with his combination of size and passing, I think that's a really good player. So that's kind of where I landed with him.
Who's somebody you don't get?
This, we disagree a lot on this one. I get it to a degree, but I do not get Cason Wallace being a top 10 pick. I think he is a very good defender. I don't think he's like one of the best defensive prospects I've ever seen. I don't know that he's the best defensive prospect in this class. I'd say he, as a perimeter defender, I'd have to look at it a little bit more, but I'd say he probably is not the best perimeter defender in this class. He has moments where he looks Drewish, which I know you sort of think he's Drew Holiday-esque. We're going to get to his offense in a second, but purely focusing on defense, which will be his calling card. I mean, I don't think he's going to be bad. I have him at 17 on my board. I think he reminds me more of like a Marcus Smart as sort of a good outcome for him with his. I don't see him as a primary ball handler, like comparing him to Jalen Hood-Schifino. I don't think he has that sort of preternatural passing ability that JHS has. I think he's a solid passer, kind of like Marcus Smart is. And his shot looks pretty good. I don't think he's ever going to be like a big pull-up threat from three, but he'll be able to hit spot ups, I think. And he's not like when I watched him, there wasn't any real offensive trait that really popped off. He was just sort of solid at a bunch of different things. And then defensively, I think he's a very good defensive prospect. But taking a very good defensive prospect as a guard with kind of an offensive game which looks solid but doesn't have anything to it, which is particularly, creative or has a lot of juice. I see him basically as more of a role player, like probably a starter, but like an off guard, maybe secondary ball handler, or maybe third guard in a rotation where he comes in and gives you perhaps some shooting, a little bit of creation and some defense. But I just don't see much of a ceiling there for him beyond like a Marcus Smart, prime Wesley Matthews, maybe Bruce Brown sort of player, which is a very useful player. And I think someone who should be picked in the top 17, but I don't see that sort of extra ceiling there for him.
I have Cason at 9. I'm really betting on his shooting. Like, I think he's going to be a great spot up shooter. And I'm hoping that a few years down the road, like he might have a pull-up game. He's already an efficient catch and shoot guy. And he is almost an elite athlete in the way that he's so well-rounded athletically. Like, he's pretty fast. He's bouncy to an extent. Like, he has really good positional size. He's long. He had an 8'5" standing reach, which is like, I think half an inch taller than what Jimmy Butler was at Jimmy's combine. Like, Cason is a really big point guard. And so I've seen a lot of evaluators try to minimize him as this quote, like 6'2.5" defense first prospect. I see him as a guy that in time could actually, because he's very strong chested and almost built like a football player, I could see him guarding a lot of twos and some threes, but certainly a lot of ones. And um, I believe in his offense a little bit more than I don't know the write-ups I've seen online, because I think that he has legit role player 3 level scoring ability. Like I think he can attack closeouts and get to the rim. He will try to dunk on you even though he can't always pull it off. And he has a smooth mid-range stroke. His shot's a little bit square and a little bit too set for me to really have hope for him as a movement shooter and like a really dynamic off the dribble guy. But I think that makes me like him more than I liked Marcus Smart years ago in his draft is I really believe in Cason's shooting. He shot really well on wide open looks this year, which I think is a good indicator. And I think that he is a less emotionally erratic player than Marcus Smart. And so I like the Marcus Smart comp for him. I just think that he has the best parts of Marcus Smart without the drawbacks that make Celtics fans want to rip their hair out. In my opinion, the best perimeter defender in this draft is Anthony Black, who I have at number 3. But Cason is way up there. For me, it's like Anthony Black, Buffkin, Kobe Buffkin from Michigan, Cason Wallace, like as like the 3 guys that if I'm in a pickup game, I do not want guarding me with the ball.
That's fair. I do think he has a very high floor. And like he'd be a great Miami Heat player. If a contender wanted to scoop him up, he could have sort of early on sort of an impact similar to with perhaps even a little bit more offense than like a Davion Mitchell had in Sacramento this last year.
I would love for him to go to like the Kyle Lowry Academy of Changing Speeds, because my one worry with Cason is that like he's pretty fast and he could be a really lethal change of pace guy. Right now, it's a lot of straight line drives at one speed, and that worries me a little bit that he just doesn't have like that natural like ball in his hands guile that a lot of guards that are not 6'8" apex wings have. So
Yeah.
he's gonna have to work on his ball handling craft a little bit, but he's 19 years old and I'm investing in an elite person.
Yeah. And that's why I think I see him more of an off guard than a lead guard.
Yeah. Okay. I don't quite get it with Keyonte George of Baylor. And it's funny because I think he was the very first player I evaluated this year. And I immediately slotted him into my lottery. And now on June 19th, I have Keyonte at 24. And the reason is the playoffs this year. They really just I've been psyoped by the most recent NBA playoffs. And actually, sorry, I'll say the last few postseasons in which we've seen very few guys in this sort of 6'4" small guard, uh, deepest bag, like 1v1 isolation genius archetype. These guys just seem to get played off the court in the playoffs. And Keyonte's offensive game is extremely enticing. He was inefficient in his 1 year of college. He shot like 30%, 37% overall, and I think it was like 34 from 3, something like that. I don't even really worry as much about the efficiency numbers on offense. I think he had to take a lot of tough shots for his team, and he, like I said, like incredibly deep bag, like a 1v1 arsenal that very few guys have in this draft. And I think he's going to be a really good shooter from 3. But he is right now, I think that he's close to a defensive 0. When his matchup blows by him, he's way too okay with it. There's way too much walking and shrugging, and it makes me not want to have him on my team. And so I was thinking about like guys in this archetype, like elite scorers who are undersized and sort of in that 6'3" to 6'5" range, who don't play great defense. And those are guys like Tyler Herro, who the Heat are probably better without now. Jordan Poole, who, I think is the most controversial Warrior, and uh, Twitter was not kind to Jordan Poole when he was in the playoffs.
Yeah.
Anthony Simons, I'm not going to say anything about Anthony Simons. I'll just think about that name for a second. Even Gabe Vincent, who was a killer for the Heat a lot of times last few weeks, was ruthlessly attacked at times by Denver. And it just got me thinking that a lot of the score first role players now tend to be guys that are closer to like 6'8", that are, at least can be that big body on defense. MPJ, Rui Hachimura, even Duncan Robinson. Like, people talk all the time about how Luka Doncic will never be Trae Young on defense just because he's 6'7" and thick.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm just, even though I think Keyonte has all of the tools to score 20 points per game in the NBA, I think it will probably be an empty calorie 20 points because his defense is so far from playable right now.
Yeah. He probably is the leader in the clubhouse for who will have a compilation video on Twitter with the caption X is a bucket or X is tough with a blowing smoke emoji. Yeah. He's going to get one of those in his first couple of years, but yeah, he's in that archetype of Poole, Simons, Jordan Clarkson's another one I'd throw in there. Jaden Hardy was a guy we saw like this last year, although I think Keontae's more polished and a better decision maker with the ball than Jaden Hardy was coming out of the G League, who he literally never saw a shot that he couldn't take. Whereas Keyonte at least has the reason I think I'm a little bit higher on him than you are is I have a little bit of hope for his playmaking ability. But really, I think he's Jordan Poole reincarnated, basically. Like, I think he has all the same strengths, all the same weaknesses. And, coming out of last year's playoffs, that guy probably would have gotten a bump in the draft based off what people saw out of Jordan Poole in that finals run for the Warriors. But coming out of this year's playoffs, when you see the importance of size and intelligence and discipline and all these things that don't apply to Jordan Poole, intelligence, I'm sure he's a smart player, but just in terms of decision making, shot selection, those kinds of things, that doesn't apply to him. So I have him at 15. He's also someone who I was higher on before. Like, the first time I watched him, I had him pretty firmly in my top 10. I had him in that sort of 5, 6, 7 range. And then I went back and rewatched him, and there's definitely more warts in terms of mentality, approach to the game, shot selection, and then just size and just ability to, even when he's trying, he's going to get blown by on defense or physically bullied at times. But when you combine that with not putting in the requisite effort, you're just going to get a pretty pitiful defensive performance, which is what you get from him a lot of the time. But he does have an elite level of kind of wiggle in his game.
Yeah.
People love people who have a bag. He definitely has probably one of the deeper bags in this whole class in terms of dribble moves, shooting off the dribble, being able to string together, like a cross between the legs, spin move into a layup. He's got that in his game.
A lot of step backs, like you said, step backs, crossovers, threes from the logo, hang dribble into a one-handed pass. Like, he's a highlight machine, and he has that Jordan Poole sexiness for sure. But another thing that worries me about Keyonte George is he has not participated in the pre-draft process at all. He did nothing at the combine. He didn't even measure. So for all I know, actually, I mean, he doesn't look that long to me on tape, but he could have a 6'10" wingspan. I'd be shocked. I think he's a 6'4" guy with probably a wingspan close to even. But he, as far as I know, he hasn't worked out for anyone, at least in the last couple of weeks. And he's been a hard man to find, which sometimes means he got a lottery promise, but who the hell knows? I like the guys that are out there betting on themselves, saying like, I'm going to go to the combine and outplay everyone there. Like an Omax Prosper from Marquette, who we'll talk about at some point. Those guys tend to pan out. The guys that look good on tape and then in pre-draft want to exploit every opportunity they can to up their draft stock. So yeah, I don't like pre-draft mystery, man.
Yeah, It's funny because I think Keyonte actually has a pretty narrow band of outcomes. Like I
Yeah.
think his ceiling and floor are pretty close together. He's never going to be a good enough uh, defender or efficient enough offensive player or high level enough playmaker that he'll be able to be a star. But I also think his shot making and creativity ability is too high for him to like completely bust out of the NBA. So, his range is probably somewhere between being a secondary scorer in your starting lineup or a secondary ball handler in your starting lineup versus being like a 6-man microwave, you know, Lou Williams, Jordan Clarkson, Jordan Poole, Anthony Simons, Tyler Hero, that kind of guy. He's just sort of the next in that lineage. And those guys have a place in the NBA. It just depends where your team wants to take them. And certainly from the playoffs we saw this past year, it's not an archetype that fared well this year anyways.
Yeah. If he ends up playing for like Udoka or Nick Nurse or Rick Carlisle or Tibbs, like he'll probably lead the G League in scoring next year.
Yeah. Kevin Porter Jr., another guy in that lineage who I think he shares some similarities with.
Yes, sir. All right. Give me your last guy.
All right. So I'm not super low on this guy, but relative to, as you're higher in the draft, these spots mean more. And a lot of boards I'm seeing increasingly are having Cam Whitmore in the 3, 4, 5 range. And I think he's solid. I have him at 8. He's sort of at the end of my third tier after that top 3. He's at the end of the tier after the top 3, basically. And when I look at him, I see someone who's, built like a house. I see a lot of similarities in terms of build and ceiling to either an OG Anunoby or Miles Bridges, taking away, all the other Bridges stuff. But
yeah,
just in terms of,
I really like the Miles Bridges comp.
Yeah. He's someone who he's really strong. I like his on-ball defense. I think he's going to be a good spot up shooter. Just the shot looks decent spotting up. Like he can be an OG level shooter. His finishing around the basket is solid. He can cut a bit, but the thing that really hangs him up with me is his playmaking and his handle. Neither of which I think are good. Especially the handle, I think is bad. So I don't see him when I maybe it's just the games I watched, but when I was watching him, I was very unimpressed with his ability to handle and get to the basket. And then, it's well documented that his assist numbers are like historically low for someone as high usage as he was. So I don't see him as having that kind of all NBA upside. I think, if things go right, he can be sort of in that fringe all-star conversation, like an OG or Miles Bridges was a couple years ago. But I think there's some Lou Dort to him as well, just in terms of that stocky wing defender who like has a little bit of offensive juice. But I don't see that sort of, first or second option on the wing type of player that some people are projecting for him, some people that have him in that top 4, because I don't think that his sort of processing speed and his handle and playmaking will ever get to the level where you're going to want to have the ball in his hands and him making decisions a lot of the time. Right. So I see him as more of a supporting player on the wing. I think with his body, defensive ability, and, athletic ability, it's worth taking a shot on him in the top 10 when you put all that together. But I don't see him as someone that I would want in the top 5, because while he's strong and athletic, his athleticism doesn't jump off the screen like the Thompson twins do. And while he's got a higher floor than them, because I know he can play defense, I know he seems like disciplined and strong, and he has a better looking shot than either of them do. I just, I have concerns about him ever being sort of like a first, second, or even third option in an offense because of his ball handling and playmaking.
I have Cam Whitmore at 5. I really believe he's one of the most interesting guys to talk about in this draft. And maybe the conversation won't go anywhere because, like you said, it's a slightly concerning tape with him. Uh, he owes a lot of money to Jaylen Brown because 2016 Jaylen Brown at Berkeley was a mess. And the Celtics said, you know what, we're going to reach for him at three, and it won't look like a reach in 7 years because of the tools and the work ethic. And of course, they were right, even though Jaylen Brown can't dribble. So, I actually, interestingly, I believe in Cam Whitmore's ball handling. I don't believe in his feel very much. I actually, even though I have him above Amen Thompson, I think Amen has way better just natural feel. And feel is one of the hardest things to project. And when I say feel, I mean live dribble passing, processing the game on offense. And we did not see high level processing from Cam Whitmore as a freshman at Villanova. 40 and a half inch vert at the combine. Let's just start talking about the things that shouldn't matter, but they're sexy. 40 and a half inch vert at the combine at 6'7". He weighs like 230 pounds. I think he's maybe hasn't even turned 19 yet. He's one of the youngest guys in the draft. He is not a guy who, at least at this stage in his basketball development, makes guys better. He is so like your typical like wing prototype body who is kind of playing on his own island. But maybe that's okay. Maybe if you have a really strong ball dominant guy, Cam Whitmore's job is to attack closeouts, become a better passer as he matures, a la Kawhi. I do, like you said, I really believe in his shooting long term. Like, I don't think he's going to be a great shooter right off the bat, but I think he's going to be a good shooter in 2 years, let's say. And elite athlete who's still figuring out how to use all of his tools. I think I agree with you that he is more of a gym athlete than a 7:30 p.m. under the lights athlete right now. But the reason I have hope for his creation ability on offense is that I'm more optimistic about his handle than it sounds like you are. Like, I think he has some really interesting like quick reaction between the legs. Like, if you reach at the ball, he has a compact handle. Like, I don't think it's ever going to be as loose as Jaylen Brown's. And then he has all the tools to be a great defender, and he had some really nice flashes. But yeah, he's definitely a high ceiling, low floor guy. His strength is also something that will get him on the floor early because he's not your typical 18-year-old. He's gonna step on the NBA floor sort of like Jarace, really belonging. I'm not in love with Whitmore. I'd be biting my nails if my team picked him. I think I've been thinking about him sort of like he's the Shaedon Sharpe of this draft. And so far it looks like Shaedon Sharpe was a good pick for the Blazers. I'd still rather have Jeremy Sohan.
Yeah. I think I'll close with there's no one in this draft who I'm in love with like I was with Jalen Williams last year. The best rookie from this class might not get picked on Thursday because he was picked last year, and it was EJ Liddell, and he didn't get a whole year to show.
Not Zion's stunt double.
I was sitting in bed the other night watching EJ Liddell highlights, and I forgot how good of a rim protector he was in college. I think I think the Pelicans will be ready for that this year. He's just been sitting in the lab with Fred Vinson, rehabbing his ACL, getting that 3-point shot good. He's going to be like Grant Williams crossed with Paul Millsap. It's a wonderful thing. But yeah, with Whitmore, I think I trust the defense more than the offense. And for that reason, I have him in the superstar role player category, but not the all NBA upside. EJ, all rookie first team.
We're excited to keep bringing you draft content. We'll probably try to get out one more draft celebration before Thursday. Thank you guys so much for listening. We'll be back.